We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
Man now has gone to the moon along the course John F. Kennedy set for this nation 6.5 years ago. And now Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders, after 6 days in space on the most epic adventure in history, are in the final, critical 50 minutes of their flight.
This is a CBS News special report. The flight of Apollo 8. This morning, re-entry and recovery, brought to you by Western Electric, manufacturing and supply unit of the Bell System, the people who provide telephones and equipment that connects them. Now reporting from the CBS News Space Center in New York, correspondent Walter Cronkite.
Everything is going well in the flight of Apollo 8 as the spaceship and its precious cargo of those 3 daring astronauts near the Earth. They're 7,800 miles away right now, traveling at 14,300 miles per hour and picking up speed rapidly as they drop toward the Earth's surface. They'll be going 25,000 miles an hour almost when they enter the Earth's atmosphere and then finally splash down at just 49 minutes and 29 seconds from now. And that splashdown is scheduled for just 6 seconds off the original time planned 4 months ago when the flight plan for Apollo 8 was put to paper. It's been a remarkable flight so far. Everything looks like it's going absolutely perfectly so far. They are in the narrow corridor they must thread to make a safe return to Earth through the blazing heat of the friction of the atmosphere, almost 5,000 degrees on the surface of their spacecraft, and down below in the mid-Pacific, 1,000 miles southwest of Hawaii, sits the aircraft carrier Yorktown waiting to recover them. They will land in the Pacific during the dark hours. It will be perhaps 40 minutes before first light, and the swimmers can jump from the hovering helicopters to bring them back to the Yorktown. However, everything is going well. The astronauts are rested, and they are on their flight plan. CBS News color coverage of the flight of Apollo 8 will continue in a moment.
Your family doctor sees something unusual. He wants to check with a heart specialist 1,000 miles away. So with a medical data set made by Western Electric, your cardiogram instantly appears before the distant specialist for his analysis. Data speeds from machine to machine, and doctor talks to doctor over regular telephone lines to save time, to save lives. Western Electric makes other data phone data sets, so your Bell telephone company can serve you in other ways too, like helping banks rush data to give you faster service, helping airlines to request and confirm your reservations in seconds. Making data phone data sets to move information at the speed of light is one of Western Electric's jobs as manufacturing and supply unit of the Bell System.
The flight of Apollo 8 is nearing its end and just about the most dangerous moments of its 6 days in space. Ahead for astronauts Borman, Lovell, and Anders is the fastest and the hottest re-entry that man has yet made into the Earth's atmosphere in this age of space flight. It's one that calls for the most precise navigation ever needed on a space flight. When Apollo 8 races into the Earth's atmosphere at 10:37 a.m. Eastern Time this morning, it must be lined up with the horizon at an angle that can vary only 1 degree either way. Now, if that angle is too steep, Apollo 8 will slam into the atmosphere with all the force of a plane flying into the side of a mountain. Gravity forces on the astronauts will build up too rapidly, and they will be crushed. And there's a possibility that in the excessive heat, the spacecraft would burn and disintegrate. If, on the other hand, the angle is too shallow, the spacecraft will skip off the top of the atmosphere like a stone skimmed across water or a ricocheting bullet, bounce back into space, and not return before the crew runs out of oxygen. Right now, Apollo 8 is right on target. It's flying down the corridor, as Mission Control calls it. It's so close on to course that a minor course correction planned for 2 hours before splashdown was canceled this morning. It wasn't needed at all. The spacecraft will separate from its service module about 15 minutes, precisely 15 minutes before it enters the atmosphere. And then once Apollo 8 hits the atmosphere at 10:37, it will race down toward Earth at almost 25,000 miles an hour, faster than man has ever traveled before. The temperature on the outside of the spacecraft will build up to about 5,000 degrees. But the spacecraft's heat shield, which really melts away as it enters at that speed, and its cooling system, should keep the temperature inside in the 70s. 9 minutes before or after entering the atmosphere, Apollo 8 will have dropped from 400,000 feet, that's almost 75 miles up, to just 10,000 feet. Its 3 big parachutes open at that point, and then 5 minutes later, the moon-circling spacecraft and its crew will drop into the Pacific near the carrier Yorktown, it is expected, and that's about 1,000 miles from Hawaii and not too far from the Christmas Islands, appropriately enough. The splashdown will be in darkness 55 minutes before dawn out there in the mid-Pacific, and everything is going well at that point. If it is going perfectly, Borman, Lovell, and Anders will stay aboard their Apollo 8 until first light. The Navy would prefer some light before its swimmers dive from the helicopters into the water to attach the flotation collar and then help the astronauts be lifted to the helicopters for the flight back to the Yorktown. The only discomfort they may suffer, if all goes well, is from the 4-foot swell and waves in the Pacific. That will bob that spacecraft, which Raw is frequently referred to as a mighty fine spacecraft, but allows a boat around quite a bit, and they could suffer a little seasickness. The weather in the recovery area is good, 4-foot waves, some scattered clouds at 2,000 feet, some more clouds around 12,000 feet, broken clouds at that point, 10 miles visibility, and some possibility of a few scattered showers. Borman, Lovell, and Anders, now less than an hour from landing back on what command pilot Frank Borman has called the Good Earth. In their last television transmission from space yesterday afternoon, it was clear that getting home was uppermost in the minds of this crew after their epic journey to the moon. The first voice we hear is that of Jim Lovell.
What we're thinking about right now, Jerry, is hitting that wedge angle about 2 degrees there limit when we come back. The Earth looks pretty small right from here.
I think I must have the feeling that the travelers in the old sailing ships used to have. We've gone on a very long voyage away from home, and now we're headed back. And I have that feeling of being proud of the trip, but still happy to be going back home and back to our home port.
We've enjoyed the television shows, and we invite you to stay tuned in the future, because there'll be flights in rendezvous in the Earth orbit, and then, of course, there'll be television from the lunar surface itself in the not too far distant future.
And now, 42 minutes before splashdown, 14 minutes before the separation of the command module and the service module, CBS News color coverage of the flight of Apollo 8 will continue in a moment.
You know what that looks like? Some licorice sticking up in a candy store.
Looks like a porcupine to me.
Like the inside of a telephone, it is. The receiver.
At our Western Electric plant in Indianapolis recently, some school children watched us make new telephones for the Bell Telephone companies.
Hold it and drill a hole in the plastic.
This is the way they saw it.
Out the middle. She's taking the telephones and she's putting them up to a machine, and then the extra plastic comes off, and then she puts them on the conveyor belt. There's 2 conveyor belts going back and forth. One's going that way and one's going this way. They're taking the housing out of a molding machine. He was cutting the extra plastic off the conveyor belt. There's 2 conveyor belts going back and forth. One's going that way and one's going this way. They're taking the housing out of a molding machine. He was cutting the extra plastic off the telephones.
She's got all kinds of wires, and she has to take about a couple of every one and put them in the telephones.
You have to have everyone exactly in order, or it'll mess up the whole telephone. She's taking the telephones and she's testing them.
Well, if the lights show up, she knows that the phone's okay.
First, they screw the dial on, then they send it on down the line, and they put the cord on, then they put the base on, then they test it, see if it works, and then it goes to the boxing part of Western Electric.
And they send him on a, conveyor, only it's like a roller coaster. And then they go down to the basement, and then somebody puts him in a truck and takes him down to Bell Telephone Company.
Children have a way of simplifying, seeing clearly what is most important.
You have to have everyone exactly in order, or it'll mess up the whole telephone.
On our job in the Bell system, Western Electric is very careful not to mess things up.
Yeah, how about that?
11 minutes now to separation of the command and service modules. 39 minutes, 40 seconds until splashdown in the Pacific for Apollo 8. Everything has been going exceedingly well, particularly the navigation of this spacecraft and the firing of its engines up to now. There have been 2 or 3 minor problems reported in the last 24 hours. Some excessive heating in the space cabin. This morning, some excessive dumping of waste water, which worried mission control a little bit, apparently not too much, and the fogging of 3 of the 5 windows in the spacecraft has become quite severe. Out at Downey, California, where this spacecraft is built by North American Rockwell, Bill Stout and North American's test astronaut Leo Krupp are standing by in our mock-up of the Apollo 8 spacecraft. I wonder, gentlemen, if you can tell us how serious these problems are, what they may portend, particularly those fogged windows in landing, and beyond that, what they're doing right now, and also how they can control the spacecraft coming into that narrow corridor. That's a big order, but I'll give you a minute and a half to do it in.
Well, Walter, Leo is telling me that 2 of the problems you mentioned apparently are related, the wastewater and the window contamination. Leo, the 2 windows that still are clear are the rendezvous windows directly above your seat and mine.
That's right, Bill. It's this window here and the one above you. These are called the rendezvous and docking windows. And really, these are the only windows that have any function during the entry. We do have etched lines on the commander's side, on Frank Borman's side on these windows. So he can use that as a visual backup to establish the correct pitch attitude for entry. We have one line on this window that's at 31.7 degrees. And when he's in the entry attitude, if he puts that etched line on the horizon of the Earth, his pitch attitude is proper for entry. So that's really the only important window for the entry maneuver.
So with all the computers, all the mathematics, all the ground control, it's a scratch on a piece of glass that helps him fly in.
Well, this is a backup just to provide the crew with a visual reference line to ensure that they do have the correct attitude. Now, if all goes well on this flight, the complete entry will be a computer-controlled entry, and the vehicle will be flown by the computer, and Borman will merely monitor the entry by watching his flight direction attitude indicator and cross-checking against his entry monitor system. And if the computer functions properly as it has throughout this flight, it will fly the vehicle completely through the maneuver down to chute deployment.
It may be that the wastewater that's been dumped out of the spacecraft is to blame for this fogging, contamination of the windows.
That's a possibility, but we would like to get some good window samples back this time. On Apollo 7, we had window contamination also, and unfortunately, the vehicle went into stable 2, and the salt water removed most of the samples off the window. Now, we hope that this vehicle will not go into stable 2, and we can get some good window samples back, and we should have a solution to this problem by the next Apollo flight.
Let's see if we can figure out what's causing it and perhaps how to cure it.
Yes, sir.
So, Walter, that's the way it is right now. They're riding down from far out in space, and it's really intriguing that with all this, there still is a mark on the window that Frank Borman has to watch while he flies the thing in, at least partly, by hand and eyeball.
Bill, I wonder if you could also show us that computer readout device that shows the path down through the corridor, the skip-out margin line and the too steep line. Could you show us that?
Leo?
Yes, Walter, that's the entry monitor system. Let me back up just a little bit before I get into the scroll. Frank checked this instrument out yesterday several times, and we're convinced it is working properly, and he did it again this morning. By going through these different test functions, he has verified that all the lights are working, that the scroll is driving properly, and the instrument is performing the way it should. He then went to range set, and he slewed in the range to go. Now, this is the range to go from the time the vehicle hits 05G, entering the atmosphere, to touchdown point. And for this particular mission, it's going to be 1,212 nautical miles. So he has slewed that value into the counter. He has then gone to entry velocity set and slewed again. This time it slews the scroll, and he's aligned the scroll to his entry velocity, which is going to be 36,300 feet per second. He then has gone to entry. Now, that sets the instrument up for entry. So as the vehicle enters the atmosphere and hits 05G, 0.05G, this light right here will come on, and at that time, he'll throw this, this switch will already be in auto, I'm sorry. This switch will be in auto, and so the accelerometer will sense 05G. And when that happens, this instrument starts to work. Now, behind this film is a clear film with an emulsion on the back of it, and behind this film is a scribe with a very sharp point on it. This scribe runs up and down depending on the acceleration of the G that the vehicle is pulling. Now, on this particular entry trajectory, we're going to pull about 6 Gs. Now, that's 6 Gs eyeballs in, so it's very comfortable to the crew. It's not like 6 Gs in an airplane where you would tend to black out. But as the vehicle starts to pull the Gs, this scribe will come down. Also, this instrument is integrating the acceleration, converting it to velocity, and the scroll is driving in this direction. So as the scroll drives across, we get a trace or a line cut on the back of this film, which shows up as a red line to the crew. Now, what the crew is trying to do, these lines coming down in this direction are the G lines. And since he is coming in at minus 6.448 degrees, he will have his lift vector up, and he will try not to violate any of these G tangency lines. If he
Leo, Leo, excuse me a minute, but I think we want to listen to mission control here. It's one of the transmissions just before separation. Here it is.
Occur about 5 minutes from now. The capsule communicator's just been advised to tell the crew we are go for that event. This, by the way, will be the fourth manned flight to be returned to the Pacific area. And coincidentally, all of the 8 series, Mercury 8, Gemini 8, and now Apollo 8, were brought back to the Pacific area. In addition, Mercury 9 landed off Hawaii. Here's some conversation. Ken Mattingly, our Capcom, is talking to Bill Anders.
Houston, Apollo 8, confirm go for pyro arm.
Apollo 8, Houston, your go for pyro arm. Apollo 8, your go for pyro arm. Everything's looking good.
Roger, everything's looking good here, Ken.
Pyro arm is the arming of the pyrotechnics that will blow the command module and the service module apart. The service module itself will then be given a slight impetus with its own engines. It will come automatically.
Recovery is advising the flight director of their good status. They see good weather out there. They're on station. The route of flight, in case you're not looking at a map, will be over northeast China, Peking, and then over Tokyo. And we start a southeastern slant. The ship Redstone is parked at 24 degrees north, 169 degrees east. And the next listening point will be the ship Huntsville, tracking a ship at 172 west, 12 degrees north. And the landing point just a few hundred miles southeast of there at 165 west, approximately 8 north. That point, by the way, is just 600 miles northwest of Christmas Island, which I'm sure has been noted.
Does it try to resurface? Over.
We're just a minute and a half from separation, which is the first essential maneuver in returning to Earth. The spacecraft could not return successfully unless the separation takes place.
Their primary evaporator has dried out, a fact that I'm sure they couldn't care less about. They're about to say goodbye to that entire system and the service module in about 2 minutes.
When the service module separates, it leaves the command module only to return to Earth. About 12 feet high it is, and that's all that comes back of the 363 feet which were blasted off in the entire rocket system from Cape Kennedy just last Saturday. As we hear the reports from Paul Haney, the voice of Mission Control, and also the voice of Ken Mattingly, who is the capsule communicator. He's one of the late class astronauts.
Is now, we see our systems here show that they have gone to Ring 2. The reaction control system, the system looks quite good. It's operational. 200 pounds of propellant available in that system. It is a redundant system.
The reaction control system is a system.
A few of the events, as we plan to clock them here, the point of 400,000 foot point, which is that point when many of our events begin to happen. We call it the area of reaching some little small amount of atmosphere.
Separation should be taking place just about now.
46 hours, 46 minutes. The blackout period should begin about 25 seconds
Our
later.
animation showed the separation at the scheduled time. We're waiting for confirmation of that from Paul Haney.
46 hours, 47 minutes, and which should occur at roughly 200,000 feet. And at this point, the roller coaster type ride that the spacecraft will take will bend slightly upward for approximately 40,000 to 50,000 feet, then level off and begin its last plunge back. But as it hits the first breaking point at 180,000 feet, the max G-force will be felt by the crew of 6.8 Gs. A second G spike of 4.2 will be noted about 4 or 5 minutes later. The total blackout we're predicting this morning is on the order of 3 minutes. But since we have very little experience re-entering at these velocities, we must caution you that those are only estimates.
We're still waiting for the confirmation of the separation, which we showed on our animation at the time it should have taken place, 13 seconds after 10:22 Eastern Time. It's now coming up to 10:24 Eastern Time.
Apollo 8, Apollo 8. Your secondary loop looks good.
Roger, Houston.
The communication sounds normal from Mission Control to the spacecraft, but Paul Haney has not confirmed separation for us yet. Separation does not have to be confirmed by voice loop, by the voices of the astronauts themselves reporting in. There is plenty of telemetry aboard which would tell Mission Control that separation has taken place. Since we heard that calm voice of Ken Mattingly just a moment ago reporting that secondary loop looked all right, we can assume that everything is going as planned, but we still haven't had that confirmation. And to make us all happier, we'd like to have it.
The flight director has confirmed separation of the command module and the service module. We've been looking at data on the command module alone, and all the values look quite good. This is Apollo Control, Houston.
And so separation has taken place. They did not say it took place on that nominal schedule, but all systems look good, so apparently things are going well with the flight of Apollo 8. Now it re-enters the atmosphere at that critical moment, which is 10:37 Eastern Time, and that's just about 12 minutes from now. CBS News color coverage of the flight of Apollo 8 will continue in a moment.
Clean air. Clean water. They're worth fighting for. At Western Electric plants, all across the country, we've been fighting for cleaner air and water for years. Fighting pollution doesn't make the telephone equipment Western Electric builds for the Bell telephone companies any better. But we breathe a little easier, knowing you do.
The Apollo spacecraft is now on its own. It does not any longer have its service system with it, with the Service Propulsion System engine. It can do nothing now but return into Earth's atmosphere, as it should be doing now, just about 10 minutes from this point. A moment ago, before we interrupted him to talk about the separation maneuver, we were talking to Leo Krupp out at the North American Rockwell plant in Downey, California, in our mock-up capsule there, about the way the spacemen can monitor in a system displayed immediately in front of Command Pilot Frank Borman their exact entry trajectory and whether they're in that narrow corridor within the 2 degrees that they're permitted deviation for a safe landing. And Leo was showing us that system. As I gather, they must come between 2 of those lines on the graph we showed you a moment ago. And I'm wondering, Leo, while that displays what they're doing coming in, can they do anything about it if those lines, if they begin to get outside of those curving lines?
Yes, Walter, as I was explaining, coming in, the trace will be coming down rather steep. Now, he does have lift vector up at this time, so he'll just maintain lift vector up. The vehicle will plunge into the atmosphere, and the G's will increase to about 6 G's, at which time the lift of the vehicle starts to take effect, and the trace will curve upward, and the G's will start to decrease. Now, the lines going in this direction across the scope are skip-out rays. Now, it's extremely important that the pilot never lets his trace get tangent to one of these skip-out rays, or there's a possibility he will leave the atmosphere, and if he leaves the atmosphere at a velocity above 25,500 feet per second, he will go into an Earth orbit. So he's holding lift vector up here to 6 G's, and then as the G trace starts to slack off and decrease, the vehicle will have to be rolled 180 degrees to put the lift vector down to prevent violating tangency on the skip-out rays. So the trace looks something like this. It comes down to 6 G's, pulls up, he will roll lift vector down, he will catch it at about 4 G's, and a constant 4G profile will then be flown until we come to subcircular velocity, which is less than 25,500 feet per second. From that point on, down to splashdown, then the vehicle will be rolling lift vector up, lift vector down to make the target, to make the range to go. While this is going on, by the way, the range counter is counting down all the time.
So as I understand it, Walter, as Leo was explaining it to me, From separation until this entry into the atmosphere where the computer takes over, Borman is in charge. He's doing all the flying himself by hand. It's not simply an automatic operation, right?
That's right. Our FDAI, or Flight Direction Attitude Indicator, at this time is at the entry attitude. Now, for separation, Borman did a 45-degree yaw out of plane with using his rotation hand controller to this point here. Then, at this point, 15 minutes before 05G, he threw his SEP switches, which are these two switches on the panel, which separated the service module. It fires the service module engines to pull it away from the command module. As soon as that maneuver was accomplished, then Borman flew the vehicle back to zero yaw angle again to the proper entry interface. Then he will check out the window to make sure that his 31.7-degree scribe line is on the horizon, and he will, with pitch control, maintain that line on the horizon to ensure that he does have the proper attitude at entry.
Thank you, Leo. There will be a couple of small skips in that entry pattern. The roller coaster effect that Paul Haney reported just a moment ago, at about 180,000 feet, they'll zoom up again for a quick ascent to another 20,000 feet up to 210,000, then come back down, and around 40 to 50,000 feet there'll be another one of these roller coaster effects, skipping up another 10,000 feet or so until they finally begin their final straight descent just before the parachutes come out. The reports from the Mission Control Center are it's a very quiet re-entry up to this point. Everything, according to Mission Control, looking good, with the point where they enter the Earth's atmosphere now just 6 minutes away.
This is Apollo Control here. We put in a call through the Redstone.
Redstone is a tracking ship. Tracking and communications ship there in the mid-Pacific.
And they were advised by Ken Mattingly that they were looking good, which they certainly are. The cabin pressure is 4.9 pounds per square inch. The cabin temperature is down a little bit, purposely so. It's down to 61. Most of the flight it ran between 77 and 78 degrees. We're estimating that the crew are still heads down and tracking the horizon visually out the rendezvous, out the windows, any handy window, and letting the GNN system do its work. At 146 hours, 41 minutes, this is Apollo Control, Houston.
Paul Haney reports that they're traveling head down. They are indeed. That, of course, makes no difference. There's still no gravity there, and it doesn't matter to them whether they're head down or not. But they are head down so that they can put that grid on the rendezvous windows, about which Leo Krupp told us a moment ago, on the horizon, and that's one of the ways that they follow themselves down and keep in the proper attitude for re-entry. Re-entry into the atmosphere is now just 5 minutes away. One of the concerns, of course, is weather in the landing zone. We've been told it looks good, but Gordon Barnes, our resident weather consultant, can tell us how good or how bad it does look.
Well, Walter, this morning down in that particular area, it's really much better than had been originally anticipated. The recovery zone is right in the middle of what is known as the intertropical convergence zone, where you normally have an abundance of warm, moist air, convective clouds, as we meteorologists call it, touching off thunderstorm activity. But during the nighttime hours, for example, this aircraft is, space capsule, excuse me, is coming down at 4:51 in the morning out there. The activity is at its weak point. Consequently, there'll be some very thin clouds up around 20,000 feet, another layer around 12,000, a few scattered clouds around 2,000. There's also a few light rain showers still in that particular area. And if any of the rain showers should move over the immediate recovery area, the visibility would be restricted to about 5 miles per hour, 5 miles. But generally visibility will be 10 to 12 miles, seas running about 4 feet high, and the air temperature right there is some 80 degrees. Yesterday, the astronauts mentioned there were some swirling clouds that they noticed on their pictures back of Earth over the nation's midsection. Those swirling clouds are now over the northeastern states, and underneath them we are getting a mixture of snow and sleet and some freezing rain, and temperatures ranging from 20 to 25 degrees. So as far as we are concerned here at our Space Weather Center, conditions in the recovery area are nominal, I guess you would call it, Walter.
Thank you, Gordon. It sounds good so far. The big problem out there is going to be the dark. They are landing for the first time at night. This has never been attempted before, although there have been a lot of practice recovery sessions at night out in the Gulf of Mexico, beyond Houston, Texas there. Jim Lovell spent 48 hours bobbing around, so he had 2 nighttime passes, and a lot of practice has been given to nighttime recovery. The actual recovery will not be attempted during the dark hours. It's only a few, about 40 minutes before first light should be expected after they are landing, and the swimmers will not be dropped from the helicopters until first light, unless Borman, Lovell, or Anders request help during the night. The Navy would prefer to wait until daylight. For one thing, sharks in those waters are a little more vicious, voracious in the pre-dawn hours than they are after light. The helicopters will be summoned to the side of the spacecraft by a visual beacon and by radio beacons, and they will hover overhead during those 40 minutes with large searchlights playing upon the spacecraft in the 4-foot waves of the Pacific, but they will not actually attempt the recovery of the astronauts until first light. CBS News color coverage of the flight of Apollo 8 will continue in a moment.
Hi, Mom. Did you remember to feed my turtle?
When you talk to someone far away, you need help. You get it from Western Electric. We're the people who make phones, wire that carries your voice to your Bell telephone company, switching equipment that selects a path for your voice, amplifiers that keep your voice strong and clear, and equipment that puts it on a coaxial cable. In fact, all along the way, your voice speeds over a lot of things Western Electric makes.
Yes, Tommy, I fed your turtle. Yes, dear, I'm taking very good care of him.
Western Electric is in the Bell system to help make sure your voice has a smooth ride every time.
Let's listen to Mission Control as they get near the atmosphere in the flight of Apollo 8. They just had a report that things were going well. They should be at the atmosphere in just about this moment.
In the course of this blackout period, which we'll be into very shortly here, the comm control will be handed over from the Redstone to the Huntsville. And we have lost signal. Our network controller says we lost signal at 1:46 minutes and with very nearly 46 seconds. And our estimate is that this blacked out period will continue, or let's see, 3 minutes.
The actual estimate on the flight plan was 3 minutes and 3 seconds. Blackout was supposed to have started at 10:37:38 Eastern Standard Time, and it apparently was just about on the dot. They entered the atmosphere 400,000 feet high.
Now the crew should be getting the spike, the G spike that they'll see, just under 7 Gs.
That means
we would estimate they're down to the 180,000 foot point, flattening out and actually beginning to ascend slightly. They should be, their heat rate will dramatically recede, but they'll still maintain a large heat load, nearly 5,000 degrees out on the leading edge of the heat shield.
7 Gs is 7 times their weight on Earth, so these 150-pound astronauts raise something like 1,050 pounds would be the effect as they are pressed against their couches. This re-entry.
The flight director notes that he hears some keying coming as in Morse code keying, and he's wondering as to the source of it. 146 hours, 48 minutes.
This is animation, but it is highly possible that the bright glow of this man-made meteorite is what it amounts to now, can be seen from the Pacific Ocean. It is in the dark, and it must be quite a sight for the
and our
astronauts.
curves put the spacecraft down about 35 to 36 miles above the Earth, and elevating slightly, perhaps up to 40. Ken Mattingly just put in a call and just frankly labeled it a radio check. He's gotten no responses yet.
If the blackout lasts as planned, it should be over in about 10 or 11 seconds from now. Never has man entered the Earth's atmosphere at this speed before. It wasn't required of Earth-orbiting spacecraft. They came in at about 17,500 miles an hour, and this is 24,600 miles an hour. Quite a difference.
And Ken tries a second call through the Huntsville.
The Huntsville is the tracking
Our
station near the landing ring.
say that the crew along about now should be emerging. The Huntsville advises they have not established contact with the spacecraft at this time.
The calculations on when the blackout should end were frankly, as Paul Haney said a moment ago, you may have
About
heard,
3.5 minutes since we went into the blacked out area.
were rough because they have not had a question of having to communicate with the men entering the
The Huntsville is handing over communication checks, communication authority to one of the range aircraft. We call them Orion.
The unmanned test vehicles Apollo 4 and 6 were driven back into the atmosphere after Earth orbit, high Earth orbit at this speed.
And the Huntsville says they have acquired an S-band signal.
They do have a
51 minutes, 4 seconds.
That does not.
And they immediately called back and said no contact. They negate that first announcement.
Oh. Well, we thought we had
One of
it.
the recovery helicopters reported seeing something, but those kind of reports at these critical moments aren't unusual.
It's now just 2 minutes past the time when we should have heard from the spacecraft through the blackout.
Ken Mattingly puts in another call. And there's Jim Lovell.
Ha-ha!
He says we're looking good. I can't tell whether it's Borman or Lovell. Let's try to cut it in.
We're real good shape here. Real fine.
Now, one of the range ships is reporting a radar contact.
Real good shape. What happy words.
The first communication was extremely broken up, but the 2 words that did come through were looking good.
Those are the sweetest words of this flight so far, of many sweet ones. Successfully going into orbit around the moon, the first time man has ever achieved.
Another one of the flight controllers here in the control center heard the crew mention something like a real fireball.
Our spacemen who have come back from the 4 Mercury orbital flights and the Gemini series all said that that's a spectacular entry in daylight.
We're about 1 minute to drogue deploy. Drogue shoots out at 23,000 feet, and the time plot says 146 hours, 54 minutes.
That should be just about 1 minute from now. Those are the small parachutes which slow the spacecraft down to about 300 miles an hour at around 23,000 feet high, which is just about 4 miles.
Yorktown is reporting and confirming a radar contact. The bearing is being passed to the recovery room here in Houston.
Your Bisky readings before drogues. Stand by. Roger, Bisky's reading plus 4 ball 7, plus 2 balls 812, minus 16502.
That's Jim Lovell.
The heat of the reentry has passed. The heavy gravity forces period has passed. But now they're still dropping at a great rate of speed, and there should go the drogues according to animation. That is on the scheduled time. We'll wait for confirmation that the drogue chutes are out. The little ones that slow it down so the big chutes will not have quite such a tug when they open a few minutes later. This still lets them drop at 300 miles per hour, hardly a safe speed for landing on the surface of the water. The large chutes, the big drogues must open. The big, that is, the big main chutes must open. There are 3 of them. If one fails, 2 are adequate to slow the spacecraft to a safe landing. We haven't had confirmation that the drogues are open yet, but according to our animation, built upon the planned timeline of this landing, the main chutes would be open at this point. This is an animation, no confirmation of chute opening yet.
Apollo Control, Houston here at 146 hours, 55 minutes. According to our numbers, we should have main chute deploy. We should have had it within the last minute. We've heard nothing but a lot of noise on the circuit for the last minute or so. It is understandable at these low-level relays when everyone is passing it. And here comes something from Apollo 8 over, he said.
Still waiting for that confirmation of chute opening.
No answer to the Apollo 8 transmission. The transmission from Apollo 8, no follow-up. In a simulation yesterday, we had extremely good communication from the recovery area, and we see, we're hopeful that that situation will be duplicated today. "146 hours, 57 minutes.
We're now 2 minutes past the point where the drogue chutes were scheduled to open, or the main chutes scheduled to open.
And according to our estimates, they should be hitting the water just about 147 hours even. If and when we get some intelligible comm, we'll come back up on the line. This is Apollo Control Houston standing by.
Well, Manned Space Center, Paul Haney, who was the voice we've been listening to there, says that they're having communication difficulty, and you heard some of the noise level in the background. So there is no confirmation that the chutes have opened. The spacecraft did successfully weather that terrible heat of reentry. It made it right down the corridor. It apparently is coming in pretty close to target. We've had no information that it is not.
This is Apollo Control Houston. 146 hours, 58 minutes. Recovery 2 within the last minute. As reported, they have a flashing light in sight, and they followed that with, "We have voice contact with the crew." I repeat, they said, "We have voice contact with the crew." at 146 hours, 58 minutes.
That would seem to indicate that
we're going to try to patch that conversation into our consoles here. Right now, we've not heard it.
It would seem to indicate that the chutes are open, because if they had not opened, the plunge to Earth would have been so rapid that by now they would have impacted, hit the Pacific Ocean. As it is, if there's voice contact, they must be floating.
A lookout on the Yorktown now reports a visual sighting. They must be close at hand. The helicopter nearest them is piloted by Lieutenant Kenneth Owen of Pensacola, Florida.
Let's go to the Yorktown with Ron Nussen reporting.
Find out how it came through this flight. The astronauts have been in voice contact with various of the recovery forces. The spacecraft has been seen on radar, and the last report was that the spaceship had passed directly over this aircraft carrier. It's going to land 5,000 yards from the Yorktown is the word that now comes from the spotters, and that has got to be one of the most accurate landings. Dallas Townsend?
Yep. Hello, Ron. Yes, we saw the spacecraft coming down off the port side of the aircraft carrier. A bright light in the sky, slowly descending toward the surface of the Pacific. It's now 5,000 yards from the Yorktown, and at just about this moment, it should be landing on the surface of the water, almost exactly on schedule, at 4:51 a.m., 4 hours, 51 minutes, 15 seconds, Yorktown time. The spacecraft heading down toward the surface of the Pacific, a perfect landing, 5,000 yards from the carrier, and that certainly is the closest in the entire history of the American spaceflight program, and undoubtedly the most direct and most accurate shooting in the history of space flight. And a large crowd of sailors were there on the flight deck watching as the spacecraft was clearly visible coming down through the atmosphere very slowly. Should be on the surface right about now, about 5,000 yards to port and slightly astern of the aircraft carrier Yorktown. And there comes one of the helicopters. We can see its bright blinking red light in the Pacific night sky heading over toward the scene. And any minute now, that helicopter will be dropping smoke bombs, smoke markers on the surface of the Pacific. And after that, the helicopter will hover overhead until the time comes to drop the swimmers. Now back to Ron Nesson.
The spaceship came down in the water. The spaceship came down in the water on the port or the left side of the aircraft carrier Yorktown, only 5,000 yards from the aircraft carrier. This spaceship, the Apollo 8, came back from farther away and came back at a higher speed than any other spaceship the Americans or the Russians have launched with men inside, and so that makes the accuracy even more amazing. The various parachutes that slowed spacecraft finally slowed it to a speed of about 17 miles an hour when it hit the water, which is a pretty good jolt. But the three astronauts were strapped down in their chairs so they wouldn't be hurt by the buffeting of re-entry or by the jolt of hitting the water at about 17 miles an hour. And also the legs of their couches were built with shock absorbers so that when the capsule did hit the water, the legs of the couches gave way somewhat and absorbed the shock. Well, now that they are back and safe and very close to the aircraft carrier Yorktown, the actual recovery of the men, the three men, and of their capsule is beginning. That's the warning klaxon that the number 3 elevator is being raised. This is the elevator that the astronauts will ride down on to the sick bay, which is over there, once they're aboard and have gone through a very brief welcoming ceremony. The general idea of the rescue, and it's still dark outside, the sun won't be up here for another 30 or 35 minutes, and the aircraft carrier officers don't like to have the white lights, either their own white lights or the television white lights turned on, because it interferes with the ability of helicopter and airplane pilots to see in the dark. So the lights on the deck have to be kept off during this period. But the general idea of the rescue is that one of the helicopters carrying 3 frogmen will approach the spacecraft, or is approaching the spacecraft right now. And we'll hook up a sea anchor, we'll hook the flotation collar around, and then we'll take the men out. And Dallas Townsend is up on the flight deck where he can see all this taking place better than I. Dallas?
Well, we've lost our signal to the Yorktown for the moment. That is likely to happen. It's rather remarkable we've got pictures at all. I think the whole space age and its communications are almost baffling to us. But out there, 1,000 miles southwest of Hawaii, that signal from the Yorktown is being relayed to a Pacific satellite and eventually to you in your homes. The spacecraft, the Apollo 8, is back, and what a remarkable trip and a remarkable conclusion to it. After 570,000 mile trip over 6 days, the spacecraft has landed within 2 3/4 miles of the carrier and may be a lot closer than that to its actual impact point, because the carrier was not under the impact point. It had to be off at the side because the accuracy of these American spaceships is so great on re-landing. CBS News color coverage of the flight of Apollo 8 will continue in a moment.
.461 individual, separate, distinct parts. They don't mean much to you yet. In fact, not until Western Electric puts them together. Precisely, efficiently. Then all 461 parts turn into a Bell telephone, so that you can dial almost anywhere. To help you keep in touch, Western Electric backs up your Bell telephone company by making dependable phones and things that connect them. Does our name ring a bell? Yes, millions of them.
Apollo 8 has ended up to this point as perfectly as it began. We have not heard yet whether the spacecraft is upright in the water, however. That could be the one malfunction so far, but it's rather anticipated by the space people. The spacecraft can either float upright in the water with its nose up and the pilots sitting in their normal fashion, lying down on the couch with their heads up. Or it can, as indeed in the earlier 2 landings of Apollo spacecraft, have ducked down with the nose in the water. In that case, they release 3 flotation bags which bring the nose upright. That can take anywhere from 4 minutes to 12 minutes or so. And this crew, in testing spacecraft out in the Gulf beyond Houston, have taken 12 minutes. In that case, there would be no communication for those 12 minutes because all of the antennas and the beacons or so forth are in the nose of the spacecraft. Ron Nesson aboard the Yorktown. Let's listen in.
Put their capsule on this cart.
Yes, well, Ron, from where I'm standing, just to the left side of the island or the carrier superstructure, I cannot see the position on the ocean where the spacecraft is now. It may be that there's a temporary loss of visibility because of one of those showers that the weather officer has been telling us about so steadily and so monotonously for the past week or so. He's been warning us of variable cloudiness with occasional showers and thunderstorms. Visibility should be 10 miles, but maybe cut to 1/4 mile in squalls. Now the carrier's loudspeaker system says that the spacecraft is visible on the port side, and I'm sure it is. It's just that from my position, I can't see it. We would expect that within 35 minutes, perhaps less than that, the swimmers will be dropping to the surface of the ocean. They'll be attaching the flotation collar and around the spacecraft to keep it stable from sinking, of course. And after that, 2 6-man rubber life rafts will be dropped to them. Then the hatch will be opened, and the astronauts will emerge from the spacecraft and clamber over the flotation collar into the life raft And after that, they will wait for the moment when the recovery helicopter will lower a basket to them, and then they will be lifted up into the helicopter. We understand that conditions are satisfactory with the command module, and the strobe light is visible from the bridge of the Yorktown. The strobe light is that very bright, pulsating light, which can be seen probably 10 miles or so.
One thing which causes that breakup in our transmission from the Yorktown is the radar aboard the Yorktown. The squiggly lines you see in your television set and the final breakup of voice and so forth is caused by all the electronic gear aboard the Yorktown. Our technicians have done a fantastic job in getting any signal out of there at all with all that interference, and we do hope to, of course, have the pictures of the Apollo 8 astronauts when they get back aboard the Yorktown sometime, presumably in the next half hour or 45 minutes. Paul Haney has reported that they are in what is called stable 1 condition. That means that their nose is out of the water, up in the air. They have not had to use the flotation bags. He also reports that the crew condition is okay. There will be a 20 to 25 minute wait for the pickup by the frogmen dropping from the helicopters for safety reasons until the first light gives them a little help out there. CBS News color coverage of the flight of Apollo 8 will continue in a moment after this pause for station identification.
The flight of Apollo 8 continues in just a moment. This is CBS.
Is now. It may be that there's a temporary loss of visibility because of one of those showers that the weather officer has been telling us about so steadily and so monotonously for the past week or so. He's been warning us of variable cloudiness with occasional showers and thunderstorms. Visibility should be 10 miles, but maybe cut to a quarter of a mile in squalls. Now the carrier's loudspeaker system says that the spacecraft is visible on the port side, and I'm sure it is. It's just that from my position, I can't see it. We would expect that within 35 minutes, perhaps less than that, the swimmers will be dropping to the surface of the ocean. They'll be attaching the flotation collar and around the spacecraft to keep it stable from sinking, of course. And after that, 2 6-man rubber life rafts will be dropped to them. Then the hatch will be opened, and the astronauts will emerge from the spacecraft and clamber over the flotation collar into the life rafts. And after that, they will wait for the moment when the recovery helicopter will lower a basket to them, and then they will be lifted up into the helicopter. We understand that conditions are satisfactory with the command module, and the strobe light is visible from the bridge of the Yorktown. The strobe light is that very bright, pulsating light, which can be seen probably 10 miles or so.
One thing which causes that breakup in our transmission from the Yorktown is the radar aboard the Yorktown. The squiggly lines you see in your television set and the final breakup of voice and so forth is caused by all the electronic gear aboard the Yorktown. Our technicians have done a fantastic job in getting any signal out of there at all with all that interference, and we do hope to, of course, have the pictures of the Apollo 8 astronauts when they get back aboard the Yorktown sometime, presumably in the next half hour or 45 minutes. Paul Haney has reported that they are in what is called stable 1 condition. That means that their nose is out of the water, up in the air. They have not had to use the flotation bags. He also reports that the crew condition is okay. There will be a 20 to 25 minute wait for the pickup by the frogmen dropping from the helicopters for safety reasons until the first light gives them a little help out there. CBS News color coverage of the flight of Apollo 8 will continue in a moment after this pause for station identification.
The flight of Apollo 8 continues in just a moment. This is CBS. Apollo 8 coverage is being brought to you by Western Electric, manufacturing and supply unit of the Bell System, as part of their continuing coverage of important news events. Western Electric, we make Bell telephones and equipment that connects them. CBS News color coverage of the flight of Apollo 8 continues. Here is Walter Cronkite.
And out in the Pacific, the flight of Apollo 8 has come to a successful conclusion. It has landed almost on its impact point after its 570,000-mile trip to the moon and back, taking man to the moon for his first close-up view. Here is Dallas Townsend on the Yorktown.
Ron Nesson, can you hear me up there on the 07 level?
Well, I'm not up on the 07 level, Dallas, but I can hear you. These, the two groups that are involved mostly in picking up the astronauts now that they are down and safe are both veterans of Vietnam, and as a matter of fact, some of the techniques they're using this morning to pick up the astronauts are the same techniques they used in Vietnam to pick up flyers which were shot down. The helicopters in this morning's operation are from Helicopter Squadron 4, and during their service on this aircraft carrier off North Vietnam, they picked up 24 flyers who had been shot down. The Frogmen belong to the underwater demolition team number 12, and they also saw service in Vietnam. There is a certain danger involved at this stage in the recovery, although the astronauts are down and say that everything is A-OK. It's because of this danger that the decision was made to let the astronauts stay in their spacecraft during this half hour or 40 minutes between their splashdown in the ocean close to the Yorktown and the time when the first rays of sun will be coming over the horizon here in the Central Pacific. If the astronauts don't get seasick during this next half hour, the plan is for them to remain in the spacecraft until it's light enough for the frogmen to see what they're doing. The danger is this: the spacecraft may still have in it some of the very exotic fuel used to fire the 10 little maneuvering engines around it. Now, if any of this exotic fuel is leaking out, and it has leaked out on other spacecraft in the past, it can burn the skin, it can burn or irritate the eyes, and it can inflame the lungs. So space officials want to be sure it's light enough for the frogmen to see what they're doing and see if there's...
Well, we lost our picture and our audio report from Ron Nesson aboard the Yorktown. At the moment, we'll have it back shortly. We hope that we are certainly going to have good pictures for you when Borman, Lovell, and Anders set foot on the Yorktown. The time situation out there regarding dawn and first light, it's 4:51. It was local time at splashdown. That was about 12 minutes ago now. The effective first light is 5:32 out there, or 26 minutes from now. That would be the time then when the frogmen would jump from the helicopters for the rescue effort. That was the effective first light as of yesterday in one of the 10 trial runs the Yorktown has made at recovery, preparing and exercising for this operation. So if the first light today is the same as yesterday, 26 minutes yet before recovery. However, the cloud cover, of course, could affect that first light this morning, and they did not tell us what the cloud cover was yesterday when they had the first light at 5:32 local time. There is a 6-hour time difference between that point southwest of Honolulu in the Pacific and our time in the eastern time zone of the United States. The recovery chopper number 3 is over the spacecraft, we have been told now, and at this point it is 6,000 yards from the Yorktown, just about 3 miles from the Yorktown at this point. The landing was tremendously accurate, of course, to come that close to the Yorktown. How close it was to the actual impact predicted point, we don't know. We've got a picture again of Dallas Townsend. Let's hear him.
The spacecraft will very soon be illuminated with the searchlight from one of the recovery helicopters, and we now understand that Recovery 3 has the command module in sight and is illuminating the spacecraft. Recovery 3, shall I go?
Well, those intermittent reports via ATS-1, the satellite over the Pacific, which is relaying the reports from the Yorktown to us viewers here in the United States. And some mighty happy viewers, we assume, in Houston, Texas, where the families of the astronauts must be celebrating at this moment. The wife and 5 children of young Bill Anders, the youngest man on the flight at 35, the only man making his first flight, the 4 children of Jim Lovell making his 3rd flight, who now has racked up far more time than any other spaceman, and I believe at this point more time than all of the Soviet cosmonauts combined. And Jim Borman making his 2nd flight as the command pilot on this mission with 2 children. Their wives and children all must be celebrating at this moment. In Houston, Texas, it's now a little after 10 o'clock there. In Mission Control, certainly the celebration is already on. The cigars have been lighted for the safe landing. They will wait, of course, for the real celebration until the astronauts are back aboard the Yorktown. Let's listen to Paul Haney.
Additional visual reports, of course, this is a flashing light seen from the Yorktown. And now illuminating the entire area is a helicopter with a big floodlight. So the entire area should be visible from the Yorktown. This is Apollo Control, Houston.
Let's try Dallas Townsend on board the Yorktown again.
Cordon down the flight deck from a position known as position spot 3.5, and that's the spot where the recovery helicopter will land on the deck, I'd say within half an hour from now, with the astronauts, with the flight physician, Dr. Clarence Jernigan, and they will be greeted there by Captain John Fifield, the commanding officer of the Yorktown.
Preparations are already underway here on the hangar deck of the Yorktown for when the astronauts come aboard, and also for when their space capsule is lifted aboard. I think we already showed you this this dolly that will be used to lash down the spacecraft when it's brought aboard. Marine guards who are attached to the aircraft carrier Yorktown have set up a cordon around this whole area to keep the curious sailors away from the spacecraft, because it does have those possibly dangerous fuels and explosives aboard. Over here in this corner, 2 NASA engineers who are in charge of looking over the spacecraft once it gets aboard are laying out all their tools and the other things they will need. If they do find any explosives still aboard which haven't gone off, they have a very simple remedy for that. They have a couple of old mattresses over there which they will put on top of the area where the explosive is. If they find any fuel left in the engines, they will plug those engines up so the fuel doesn't leak out and hurt somebody. When the astronauts finally are aboard and have gone through their welcoming ceremony up on the deck, they will come down this number 3 elevator and walk across this cordoned off area and through or down a steep metal stairway to the ship's hospital, or sick bay as it's called on the ship. And they will immediately begin their medical examinations. The first part of their stay there will be to get out of their space suits, have the sensors which were attached to their bodies to measure their heartbeat and their breathing during the flight. Those will be taken off. The medical examination altogether will last 3 or 4 hours. There'll be blood tests made to see if their white blood cells were affected by the long period in space. There will be x-rays made of their heel bone and their finger bones to see if the long period of weightlessness has caused them to lose calcium. There'll be a couple of rather exotic tests made there in the sick bay to find out how the period of weightlessness affected their heart action and their blood vessel action and their muscles. One of these will involve getting into a box from the waist down, being sealed up, and air pressure pumped into the box, and then the action of the blood vessels in the legs measured. Another one of the tests involves really nothing more than an exercise cycle like a lot of people have in their homes or in gymnasiums, and the astronauts will get on that and pedal. The thing is hooked up to a fancy electronic gadget which will measure their breathing and heart rate and muscle action to see how those were affected by the trip in space. At some point during all this medical examination, the astronauts will step just outside the sick bay to take the traditional phone call from President Johnson. Well, all that is in the few hours ahead. The first matter is to get the astronauts back on the ship, and Dallas is watching out for that on the flight deck. Dallas Townsend?
Well, here on the flight deck, the preparations are going forward rapidly. A movable wooden platform, which will be brought up to the door of the helicopter, is already almost in place. That double line of sailors is out on deck, ready to pay honor to the astronauts when they arrive on the aircraft carrier. Captain Fifield is not in evidence. He, of course, is still on the bridge, but he will be coming down shortly to the flight deck to represent the carrier Yorktown and the Navy as the ranking representative of the Navy here to greet the astronauts on their return from space. His executive officer, Commander William Parks, will not be here. Commander Parks has been flying today as Air Boss 1, the man in direct charge of the recovery operations. He's been in one of those fixed-wing aircraft, the E-1Bs, sometimes popularly known as the Willie Fudds. He took off from the deck of the carrier about an hour and a half ago, and he has been supervising the operation of the recovery of the spacecraft. After they come on deck, there will be the welcoming ceremonies by Captain Fifield and by the senior NASA representatives on board, John Stonecipher and Ben James, who's the public affairs representative. After that, down to the sick bay for the medical examination, up to the flight deck, up to the hangar deck to inspect the command module, which by that time will be on board. Then, following a rather rigorous schedule, still in line with what they've been following the past week or so, not as rigorous as that, but still with plenty of events on it, they go up to Captain Fifield's quarters for lunch, and after that back down to the sick bay for further medical examination. This evening, they'll appear in the Yorktown wardroom for dinner with the officers, and then they will come out on the hangar deck at a ceremony at which Captain Lovell will re-enlist a number of members of the crew of the Yorktown. The latest from the spacecraft, Apollo 8, says he is glad to see us. And I'm sure that that sentiment is reciprocated by every member of the crew and all others on board the aircraft carrier. We certainly are glad to see Apollo 8.
Dallas Townsend reporting from the Yorktown.
It's one of exultation, Walter. We were told before splashdown that mission
Control was starting to fill up very early, nearly 2 hours before scheduled splash. And as you can see, there are extra people around the consoles. The visitors section is filled up, and among those visitors is Thomas Paine, who is the acting administrator of NASA. We talked to him last night, asked him about the flight. He was, of course, very pleased, but he expressed a rather universal sentiment that he would be most happy when those men are on the carrier. And, of course, that's what's being waited for now. The families of the astronauts have not said anything yet. We can certainly assume they're happy, and they're waiting until Borman, Lovell, and Anders are on the carrier, too, and then we'll hear more from them. But it's a pretty happy time down here right now, Walter.
We've only had one occasion, of course, in all of manned space flight since our first suborbital flight of a U.S. spacecraft in 1961, after the men have been on the surface of the water. And that was in the second suborbital flight flown by Gus Grissom in his Mercury capsule. And as you remember, he sank in one of the deepest points of the Atlantic. His capsule did, that is. He was pulled away after going into the water just barely in time. Gus Grissom later to lose his life in the fire aboard the Apollo 204 spacecraft at Cape Kennedy. Borman reported to the helicopter crew, or asked the helicopter crew just a moment ago, do you see us? And the proper commander said, of course they did, and then they turned on the lights, so it was clear that they saw them. That's the recovery chopper number 3, as you've heard Dallas Townsend report from the aircraft carrier Yorktown. The men, after the routine that Dallas reported to you a moment ago, on tomorrow morning will fly to Hawaii, transfer there to another aircraft, and go straight to Houston, arriving in Houston time, 4 a.m. Sunday morning, 5 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Then when they land at Ellington Field, just a couple of miles from their homes near the Space Center. They'll be met by their families at that point, unless somebody in their great enthusiasm over the next few hours decides to fly those families out to Hawaii. That doesn't seem likely at the moment. The plan is for the families, the 3 wives, and the total of 11 children to wait in Houston until Sunday morning's return. After that, the men will go through a long debriefing period. Everybody wants to know, of course, in Houston, all the scientists want to know the details of the spacecraft performance. They know that it worked well, but they want a little more engineering data than that. They want to, of course, all the scientists want to hear about the moon and what it really looked like close up, and they'll all be waiting for the development of the still pictures and the movie pictures taken of the moon's surface and of the Earth as seen from the moon. Paul Haney again at Mission Control.
Communicator here is just try to call through an Orion aircraft. And that while we try to establish the communication on that shot, we've been advised that the ship is now 3,800 yards away, and it's off the port side of the ship. Well, the Yorktown has also advised us that in about 14 minutes they expect to deploy their first swimmers. About 14 minutes from now. This is Apollo Control, Houston.
They're 2¼ miles from the Yorktown at this point. The helicopter will deploy the swimmers, as you heard Paul Haney said, say just after 11:30 Eastern Standard Time, about 12 to 14 minutes from now. In Houston, the acting head of the space program, Dr. Thomas O. Paine, has said that, of course, that he exults in the success of this mission, and he says also this is the beginning of a movement that will never stop. Man has started his drive out into the universe. 100,000 miles from Earth, there is no room for a space race no place for Russian-American competition. This is something for all mankind. Now back to Paul Haney.
This is primary leader. Apollo 8's been advised to expect call 296H right aircraft, over.
This is Apollo Control Houston. That begins to make you understand the size of our communication problem. It isn't a matter of just understanding every other word. It's a case of trying to understand a piece of every other conversation. But we're cheered up and we feel good. We know the crew is feeling fine. And within a very few minutes, swimmers will be in the water. And we should start the movement of the crew into the helicopters and over to the Yorktown. This is Apollo Control, Houston.
So we got perfect communications from the moon, 230,000 miles away, but virtually none from 2.5 miles from the Yorktown or 1,050 miles from Hawaii. They will have better communication from the Yorktown itself, and you did hear a moment ago from Dallas Townsend and Ron Nissen reporting from the decks of the Yorktown by way of the Pacific satellite with color pictures from there, no less. A remarkable feat of communications in itself. But nothing, of course, matches the fabulous feat of Apollo 8. All the way out to the moon, around the moon 10 times, television pictures twice from the spacecraft just 70 miles over the surface of the moon, 4 other television transmissions, 2 on the way out, 2 on the way back. Presumably they got good motion pictures and strip photographs of the moon's surface. They had a good look at the preferred site for landing a man on the moon, and they're coming home with all of their scientific data. What they proved out primarily in Apollo 8 is that the flight could be done. Now the next step is to put man on the surface of the moon itself. The next flight of the Apollo spacecraft series, Apollo 9, is scheduled for late February or early March. That is to go into orbit around the Earth and test out the lunar module, the smaller spacecraft that will detach itself from the larger Apollo 8 command module and land on the moon's surface and then blast off again to return the 2 men who go to the moon back to the waiting astronauts circling the moon in the command module. That test will be in Earth orbit, as we said. The spacecraft will separate and pick up the lunar module from the Saturn 4B, third stage of the rocket, and the LEM adapter. That is a lunar module adapter. It will then drop that lunar module in Earth orbit down a few thousand feet, and it'll come back and rendezvous for the test. Then perhaps in April or May, more likely the middle of May, the Apollo 10 with Tom Stafford in command will go out to the moon with a lunar module, if that first test works out all right. Circle the moon again, as did this flight, and let the lunar module down to 50,000 feet of the moon's surface. It is not supposed to land Now, there's been a lot of eyebrow raising and some sort of knowing smiles around the Manned Space Center about that flight, as if when they get down to 50,000 feet above the moon, they're going to go on down and make the landing there. But just today, Tom Paine, the acting head of NASA, said he does not favor such an operation, that he favors that test down to about 10 miles from the moon's surface before they make the landing in Apollo 11, which would be in the middle of July. Frank Borman told the chopper pilot just a moment ago that the moon is not made of green cheese, it's made of American cheese. These fellows, their sense of humor has been developing rather rapidly since they've made the flight around the moon and started back home again. Yesterday, Bill Anders said that he thought he was hearing music, and he wasn't hearing any, and he said, for goodness sakes, don't let the doctors know that. And then a little later on, he did hear music, and he said, if that's really music you're piping up to us, I'd just as soon not hear it. But all in a joking mood. Bill Stout and Leo Krupp, perhaps for the last time in these long 6 days of this flight, could we switch out there and see if you've lighted up your congratulatory cigars yet?
Leo has a few chores that he can show us, Walter, that Borman, Lovell, and Anders had to go through. The beacons, the light we keep hearing about that the chopper pilot zeroed in on, and the float bags, you call them, flotation gear. Leo, can you show us those?
Well, the first thing that Frank did as soon as they touched down on the water was release the main chute with this switch here. And evidently, he did it rather rapidly because the vehicle was not pulled over into stable 2, so we should have some good window samples this time. As soon as they're on the water, their next concern was to get fresh air into the cockpit. So they pull that valve there, which opens up 2 openings on the upper deck, and then with a fan over on my panel, we get air through those 3 post-landing ventilation ducts.
That's all these are here for, is to bring in air after landing.
That's true. Now over on this panel, this is the switch that turns the fan on. That'll control how much air we get into the cockpit. This turns on the beacon's light, which is the flashing light that the helicopters picked up. And this switch here is the dye marker, which they've deployed, which also opens up the receptacle for the swimmer's umbilical. When the swimmers get in the water, they'll be able to plug in a telephone and talk directly to the crew in the cockpit. Since they stayed in stable 1, they had to wait 10 minutes to allow the outside of the vehicle to cool off. But as soon as that 10 minutes cooling period had elapsed, Frank would fill all of his 3 float bags, which would then prevent the vehicle from tipping over into stable 2.
On the Yorktown, they were talking about getting rid of the fuel that was left in the spacecraft. Is that a ticklish operation?
Bill? Bill
yes,
and Leo, I just want to interrupt you half a second here to tell you that a report from the Yorktown says that the first light of dawn is just appearing in the eastern sky, and they expect the swimmers to be dropping from the helicopters any minute now. Go ahead. Oh, we just heard that the swimmers will go into the water in 4 to 5 minutes. Go ahead, Bill.
Oh, I was just asking Leo, Walter, whether getting rid of the fuel that's left is at all a touchy proposition.
No, the fuel is burned through the regular RCS engines, and the way that is done is as soon as the main chutes are deployed, Frank just throws this logic switch and the dump switch. That allows the remaining propellants to flow into to 10 of the 12 engines. There are 2 pitch engines we don't fire because we don't want to get any fumes back into the cockpit. But through the other 10 engines, we run all the fuel and completely burn it all out. When the engine stops firing, then we throw a purge switch, which is this switch here, which completely purges the line. This minimizes the possibility of a fire in the event one of the lines should rupture on touchdown.
So at this point, the only real risk is seasickness, I suppose. After all that time in weightlessness, I imagine 4-foot swells are kind of hard to take.
Lovell better not get sick, being a Navy captain.
You know, Walter, it's really kind of an old home week for Leo. The Yorktown was his carrier during the war.
I didn't know that, but congratulations, Leo.
Thank you.
Yorktown is, what is she? She's, she's about 25 years old, isn't it?
That's CV-10, Walter, and that's the fighting lady of World War II fame.
All right. You're getting that plug.
Yes, sir. I would like to say also that I feel real proud of the NASA job that's been performed on this flight. They've demonstrated that they can thread a needle with this spacecraft anywhere in flight, and I know that the confidence of all Americans, and especially the astronaut crews, is going to be greatly elated over this particular flight, because the NASA team, the controllers, the tracking station, their trajectory people have just done an outstanding job.
You know, Leo, what occurs to me about all this is that as amazing, startling, fabulous, unbelievable as this flight is, they make it look so easy, working it out as cleanly as it has been worked out, with the launch right on schedule, the return right on schedule, every function going just as it had been planned, that I think all of us are inclined to be just a little bit, although amazed, we still can be a little bit blasé. It just seems so easy. You wonder, what are the limits of man's capabilities in space? Leo, thank you very much for your help during the 6 days of this flight. It has been great indeed. I don't know whether we'll be getting back to you again, because I suspect that shortly we will be seeing the astronauts landing back on the deck of the carrier, and that will complete the flight portion, certainly, of this mission. But thanks very much for your cooperation and that of North American Rockwell, the builders of this fantastic spacecraft out there in Downey, California. Bill Stout, I need not thank you. You're on the payroll. But thanks.
I'm glad I'm still on, Walter.
Well, I can assure you, Bill. At least I think I can. I can't really speak for management, but I think we both are, Bill. Thanks very much, gentlemen at Downey, and thank everybody out there for us. CBS News color coverage of the flight of Apollo 8 will continue in a moment.
Who in the world would treat a telephone this way? Western Electric. Western Electric builds rugged phones and tests some of them beyond endurance. Chances are, the phone your Bell Telephone Company installs will never need repair. You can take your Bell phone for granted, because we don't at Western Electric, manufacturing and supply unit of the Bell system.
The flight of Apollo 8 is over. All that remains is to remove the astronauts from the spacecraft and carry them less than 2 miles to the deck of the carrier Yorktown, which was just 2 3/4 miles from the splashdown point. Exactly how accurate the spacecraft was at its impact point, we have not determined yet. It was only 2 3/4 miles, 5,000 yards or so from the Yorktown. The Yorktown originally was scheduled to be about 5 miles from the impact point. If these figures would check out on a direct line, it would indicate that perhaps the spacecraft was 3 1/4 miles from its predicted impact point, which is an amazing feat indeed after a flight of 570,000 miles through space. The crew of the spacecraft has ordered steak and eggs, we're told, same as we had before we left. Their last meal on Earth before they went on the space food in the spacecraft, which they have said is reasonably good, sort of a restrained statement. They had the steak and eggs and orange juice and so forth there at Merritt Island in their crew quarters before they left on last Saturday morning, just 6 days ago. We've been talking about their capabilities of controlling the spacecraft. I might point out again, we just heard that the first swimmer has gone into the water at that point, 1,000 miles from Hawaii. The helicopter is dropping its swimmers. First light came 6 minutes ago, and they didn't waste any time. They're in the water. A sea anchor has been attached to keep the spacecraft from floating away any further and to help stabilize it. They'll be putting the flotation collar on in just a moment. The 3 flotation bags are already on. Let's call in Paul Haney at Mission Control. Paul? He's been reporting on these events sporadically, and we get every report he's got and relay it to you. Sometimes we listen directly. Right now he's off the air. We'll come back when he comes back on. We're talking about the way the spacecraft is controlled, the lift factor. It wouldn't look like this spacecraft would have any lift at all, of course. It looks like it would fall just like a stone. Well, it almost does, but it's got about a 5% lift factor created by the heat shield, the blunt end of the spacecraft being a little bit off-center, so that there is a center of balance below this, and the spacecraft heat shield, the blunt end, being not quite perfectly around. By giving it a little bit of lift, like an airplane wing, and rolling the spacecraft just to the right number of degrees, they can create more or less lift, bringing the spacecraft up and bouncing it into the landing, cutting down on the heavy G-forces and directing it right to the landing point. That can be done either by the computers or by the men in the spacecraft themselves flying it in. We have not heard that they used the manual controls on this flight. It was probably a computerized reentry that brought the spacecraft right down to the target point. Dallas Townsend on board the Yorktown.
Kind of sight that I've never seen anywhere else. I imagine you feel very much the same way.
Well, this whole occasion is a great historic occasion. It must be something like when Columbus perhaps returned from discovering the Americas, or Magellan's ships returned from the first cruise around the world. This is equal, perhaps even a greater occasion than those.
Yes, well, I think it may well rank with them, Ron, but it's safe to say also that they didn't get the kind of welcome when they got back, when Columbus and Magellan got back, that Borman, Lovell, and Anders are going to get a few minutes from now on the flight deck of the Yorktown. This is a well-organized reception, and the reception also that, when I think about it, I'm just amazed at how marvelously this whole operation has gone, right down to almost the last second, planned weeks and even months ago. We were told when we came on board the Yorktown that the swimmers would drop in the water at first light about 5:35, and that's exactly when they did it.
Well, we've lost that picture and transmission from the Yorktown again. Whether that happens when the Yorktown powers up extra radar or what, we haven't been told, but the radar and all the communications facilities on the Yorktown do cause some interference with our television picture, which of course is secondary to the radar working. The situation as of this moment, in our last information from Paul Haney at Mission Control, was that the swimmers were in the water. They were attaching the flotation collar around the spacecraft, and the next step is for the astronauts to emerge through the hatch of the spacecraft to the harness which will carry them up to the waiting helicopter and onto the deck of the Yorktown. The flight to the Yorktown will be a very brief passage. They're only a couple of miles from the Yorktown at this point, and as the light comes up over the Pacific, the men on the Yorktown will see the spacecraft bobbing there in the water, and probably there'll be enough light for them to see just 2 miles away the recovery of the astronauts themselves. When they get to the Yorktown, they'll cross a red carpet to microphones, and perhaps we'll hear a word or two from them before they go down for their first medical checks and their first very brief reports from their remarkable flight to the moon and back. And then they have 20 hours on the Yorktown before they fly to Hawaii and on home to Houston tomorrow. The future plans for space missions, of course, have been accelerated considerably by this flight. It means that they can keep to the hoped-for schedule of the next Apollo 9 mission late in February or early in March to test out the landing module and then move on toward landing a man on the moon 2 flights further on in the middle of July. We get back from that 363 feet that blasted off from the Florida Launch Complex, the moon port, in its first use as a moon port. We got back just to 12 feet of the command module, the spacecraft itself. Here is the picture of the whole thing. That is the Saturn V, the big baby that did the job. 3 stages of it. 7.5 million pounds of thrust in that stage alone. And each of the little engines in there generates 4 to 5 times as much power as one of the rockets, the rocket that put up our first man in orbital flight in the Mercury program. But there are 3 stages, and this was the stage that finally went on out to the moon. The escape tower had been blasted off during the launch phase. This is what went out to the moon. That service module, so-called, and the command module. And then, just 15 minutes before they re-entered the Earth's atmosphere at 10:37 Eastern Time this morning, just a little over an hour ago, these two separated. The service module dropped away. They're waiting to find out what happened to that service module. There was a lot of speculation. It was fired away from the command module, and whether it skipped out of the Earth's atmosphere back into an Earth orbit or re-entered the Earth's atmosphere and perhaps burned up in that re-entry, or maybe made a landing in the Pacific. And one calculation was it might just be 100 miles or so from where the command module landed. We have not had confirmation on as yet. But this is what finally came back. From all of this that went up into space a week ago, Saturday morning, or last Saturday morning, this is what we've gotten back in scale. But that's the important part, because there's where the 3 astronauts rode for these 6 historic days. Let me show you, since we have the model out, what will take place in the flight of Apollo 9. Which, as I say, is scheduled for, I'm not in as good shape as the astronauts this morning, apparently. They're in perfect shape, we've been told. On Apollo 9, which will be the flight that goes in late February, early March, after the blast-off, the launch tower escapes, and then as they get out into space, this 3rd stage puts them into the lunar trajectory. Which is as on Apollo 8 flight. It will not actually be a lunar trajectory this time. This will be so phased and will be fired in such a way that they'll go into a high Earth trajectory, high Earth orbit. And while circling in that high Earth orbit, they will then go through the maneuvers that will take place at about that same point in space when the next flight, Apollo 10, goes all the way to the moon. And what happens in that case, the service module and its command module separate. Then the fairing drops off. Actually, it opens in a set of 4 sort of butterfly panels, which are not shown here. And the lunar excursion module is then revealed. The spacecraft is turned around in this sort of maneuver, and if you'll remember, Apollo 8 tested that maneuver. Although there was no spacecraft here, both Apollo 7 and 8 tested it. They did turn around and come in and take a look at the opening where the lunar module will be on Apollo 9. They come in and they pick up the lunar module in approximately this fashion. I can't seem to hook on there. We're hooked on. And it pulls it loose. Now, I don't have enough hands, and the spacecraft works a lot better than I do. But, of course, it's computerized. And pulls the LEM out like this, the lunar module out. The stage 4B, S4B, which is the 3rd stage, goes on into around the moon, perhaps, and on out to a solar orbit. And then this is in flight out to the moon. On the Apollo 9 flight, this much will go in the high Earth orbit. On the moon flight, they will go on out to the moon, of course. In the Apollo 9 flight in Earth orbit, as they're coming around the Earth, they will then fly this thing out, and they will, 2 men in the command module, crawl through this little docking collar down into the LEM. They separate again like this, and while the command module station keeps, this drops down in the Earth orbit and just tests its flight characteristics, that it can fly well, go down and come back up again. It's got plenty of propulsive power, that everything works well. If it does not in this test, the command module can maneuver around and rescue it, but it is expected to come back to the proper attitude, and this is the way it would come off the moon. Well, not quite. Let me show you that in just a moment. They reconnect then, and the 2 astronauts pass into the command module and then come back to Earth. Now, on the moon flight, we'll work this way. They get to the moon, they separate, this lands on the moon. On the surface of the moon, in thus fashion, and spreads out the legs, sits on the moon, and after the two astronauts have climbed down, explored the moon's surface, gone back into the LEM, the bottom of the LEM becomes its launch platform, and this much.
A moment ago, I believe, the astronauts have been instructed to get out of the spacecraft, get into the life rafts, and the swimmers are now removing their oxygen bottles, and the swimmers are in the life raft taking off their gear. That means that the dangerous part of the operation, as far as they're concerned, is over.
You were talking about how close the space capsule came down to the aircraft carrier, Dallas. Over the past several days, everyone has been speculating about the dangers involved in this return. Men have never come back this fast from space, 25,000 miles an hour, and have never come back from so far away. And coming back at that speed, there was the danger that when the spaceship hit the atmosphere, the outer edge of the atmosphere at 400,000 feet or 67 miles, if it hit too sharply, it might burn up like a shooting star, or if it hit at too shallow an angle, it could spin off like a rock across a pond. But none of those things happened. And the space capsule came down after the flight around the moon and back and landed within a couple of thousand yards of what it was aiming for.
We have word now that the astronauts are inquiring about the swimmers working on the hatch, and the swimmers are now, I suppose that means that they're in contact with the astronauts. We heard a few moments ago that they had not. And we have word now the hatch is open. The hatch is open. Any moment now, the astronauts should begin to get out. Recovery 3, as we suspected, is making the recovery. The Recovery 3, I'm reading notes just the way you are, Ron. The Recovery 3 is the lead swimmer. Yes, well, that should be Lieutenant J.G. Richard Flanagan, as we suspected a moment ago. He's the commanding officer of the Underwater Demolition Team Detachment on board, UDT-12. And he and his highly trained men have jumped into the ocean, and they are taking care of these final essential moments in the recovery of the Apollo 8 astronauts.
One of the things waiting for the astronauts on the ship is a really enormous cake, 7 feet long and 3 feet wide and 14 layers high, which the cooks have been working on for some time. It's actually about 57 small cakes plastered together with vanilla icing. First astronaut is getting out of his capsule now. Do we have the name of who's getting out first? He's whoever he is. He's standing in the standing on the side, actually, standing on the on top of the flotation collar. One astronaut is out through the hatch, standing on the side of
that
the
word
spacecraft.
now that a second astronaut is coming out. Second astronaut coming out of the hatch, he probably will also be standing on the flotation collar. The first one probably is in the raft by this time.
I wonder if the captain leaves the ship first or last.
Well, when there's no danger of the ship sinking, I suppose there's nothing wrong with the captain leaving first. Third one is standing in the hatch, coming out of the hatch. We're giving you practically a blow-by-blow description, which we're getting by means of scribbled notes coming to us from Flag Operations. All of them are on the flotation collar. All 3 of the astronauts, Borman, Lovell, and Anders. Any moment now, they'll be climbing from the flotation collar into the spacecraft. The carrier is now beginning to come around. The carrier is making a left turn.
Astronauts will be coming aboard shortly.
You probably heard that on the loudspeaker system. Astronauts will be coming aboard shortly. A lot of the sailors here are dressed in their flight deck gear, red, blue, green shirts designating the various functions which they perform. A good many of them wearing their Mickey Mouse hats and the headsets with which they maintain contact with flight operations. Most of the sailors, however, are in dress whites. And we have word now, the swimmers and the astronauts. First came Lovell, then came Borman, and Anders third.
So the captain got out in the middle.
In the middle, yes. Well, that's a safe place to get out. And the sky is very bright now. It's a lovely morning, partly cloudy, but really beautiful out here in the middle of the Pacific. The sky tinged with yellow and pink, and beyond it, the very light blue of the early morning. The sun isn't up yet, but probably will be quite shortly.
One of the frogmen has now closed the hatch again. It'll be some time before the aircraft carrier can maneuver up alongside the capsule and lift it on. And the Navy officials and space officials don't want anything to happen to it, so they've closed the hatch to keep the water out. The swimmers will stay with the capsule while the astronauts are lifted into the helicopter and flown to the deck.
You probably noticed, Ron, that the carrier has been heeling to starboard as she turns left. That's something that surprises a lot of people who come on board. The carrier, once in a while on the loudspeaker system, will say, stand by for heel to starboard, whereupon the carrier makes a left turn. But it's quite logical when you stop to think about it. You know, I really can't get over my sense of amazement and wonder that this immensely complicated operation, planned so long ago and worked out in great detail a year and a half ago, has been completed just about exactly the way its planners expected and hoped. It certainly is a tremendous tribute to American technology and American planning. Carrier still turning left, coming into the correct position for the helicopter to come on board. Probably at the same time as the recovery helicopter comes on, the photo helicopter will also be putting down on the flight deck, but farther forward. The photo helicopter, of course, has been taking close-up pictures of the recovery scene, and these will no doubt appear in the next few days once the carrier gets back within air flight of land. Anders is now in the second life raft. All three are now in the second life raft, and they are free of the spacecraft. So the next step, very few minutes from now, will be to lower the basket from the recovery helicopter. The helicopter is now moving into place over the scene to pick up the astronauts. It will lower that basket into which they can climb one after the other. It's called the Billy Pugh basket, and you can crawl into it, climb into it, tumble into it, do almost anything, and no matter what happens, you probably will get into it one way or another. And it's so constructed that no matter what position you're in, it's easy for the men on board the helicopter to crank the basket up to the door of the helicopter and haul you inside. And that's what's happening to the astronauts, or will be any moment now.
These helicopters, normally, the Helicopter Squadron 4 normally is on anti-submarine duty. And the center of the compartment is normally taken up with sonar, but that's been taken out to make more room for the astronauts. Now, the first astronaut is in the basket just before being hauled up into the helicopter. And he's on his way. Halfway up? Well, that is minute-by-minute reporting. The first astronaut is in the basket and is halfway up.
That's practically breath by breath. Well, at the rate they're going, the other two ought to be in the helicopter within a very short time, just a couple of minutes, I imagine. Just the amount of time it'll take them to get the first astronaut out of the Billy Pugh basket and lower it away for the other two to make their way up to the helicopter. And after that, it will be directly back here to the flight deck and the welcome. And the skies are now are quite bright. Cloudy but bright, windy today. There still seems to be a hint of rain in the air. I wouldn't be surprised if we had a shower or two. In fact, I think I can see a shower off on the horizon somewhere, but it doesn't seem to be too close to the carrier. These showers have a wonderful way of springing up almost out of nowhere, and they're upon you before you know it. And they do have a way of decreasing the visibility sharply.
The first astronaut is in the helicopter. The basket's reached the top of the line, and he's been pulled into the helicopter and seated in the canvas bucket seats and strapped in, and the basket is now ready to descend and pick the second astronaut out of his yellow rubber raft. What was that?
Down here on the flight deck, the colors have been unfurled. The Stars and Stripes, flag of the United States Navy, flag of the Yorktown, standing by here, ready to take part in this ceremony. There is no band on deck today. We have had a band in quite a few of the other astronaut receptions, but for reasons that are probably best known to the Navy, no band sailed aboard the Yorktown when we left Pearl Harbor about a week and a half ago. Basket's going down for the second astronaut who's in the water, and the second astronaut is now on the way up.
And he's halfway up.
Yes, indeed. And guess what will happen then, Ron? The third astronaut will be on his way up.
And then we'll get a report that he's halfway up.
We're still waiting for that red carpet out here.
The second astronaut is in the helicopter now. So now there are 2 astronauts in the helicopter, and the last one waiting in the water for the basket to come down and pick him up. The basket's on its way down now. So Dallas, very shortly now, the helicopter, Recovery 3 helicopter, with Commander Jones at the controls, ought to be flying back toward the ship for these welcoming ceremonies that you've described. The basket's going down for the last time now. And what's happening? The basket's in the water. It's easy for a man to flop into these Billy Pugh nets. They used to use the horse collars, the yellow horse collars that you had to slip under your arms and across your chest. And they found that a lot of people who needed rescuing couldn't figure out how to get into these things, or slipped out of them, or wrenched their shoulders. So they've gone to using the Billy Pugh basket, and you just have to sort of roll toward it or flop into it, and you're caught inside. The third astronaut now is on his way up in the basket, and I know the next report we're going to hear is that it's halfway up.
We're having a stiff breeze out here on the flight deck. Now, Ron, they just unfurled the colors of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and they've whipped about bravely. They've pulled them back onto the staff now, so they won't get too much of a beating before the welcoming ceremony.
All the astronauts are inside the helicopter, Recovery Helicopter number 3. They've been taken out of their capsule after riding it for about 45, 50 minutes in the dark, taken into rubber rafts, raised one at a